opens lines for queen and bishop, immediately contesting the center and dictating early development. Immediately establishing asymmetry, this Sicilian defense creates a fascinating fight for the central squares and opens dynamic avenues for queenside counterplay. A flexible way to prepare for various Sicilian defenses, eyeing central control and piece development. Opens lines for the queen and bishop, preparing a solid pawn structure to contest the center. Opens the center, demanding an immediate response and creating dynamic pawn tension across the board. Initiating pawn exchange opens lines for knights and bishops, demanding careful piece development. Unleashing the knight centrally, white immediately contests the d-file and opens lines for future development, embracing tactical freedom. Developing the knight to its natural square, this move contests the center and prepares for further piece activity, subtly preparing to challenge white's central pawn structure. Securing the d4 knight and preparing kingside castling, white gently pressures the center's integrity. Developing the queen to c7 supports central pawns and prepares queenside expansion, aiming for a solid, flexible setup against white's active knight. Developing the bishop to this square exerts pressure on black's queen and prepares to castle kingside, aiming for a swift development of white's pieces and potential kingside attacking opportunities as the pawn structure begins to solidify. Securing the queenside flank, this pawn advance preempts any immediate knight or bishop incursions to b5 or b4, establishing a subtle yet significant defensive foothold and preparing for potential queenside expansion. Unleashing the queen to f3 immediately puts pressure on the d5 square, eyeing a potential central breakthrough and preparing for kingside development. Introducing knight to e5 immediately challenges the queen and creates immediate tactical possibilities, but it also exposes the king's defender to potential discoveries if white's pieces are coordinated effectively. Black is aiming for active piece play, hoping to disrupt white's development or force favorable exchanges, though this early commitment might prove risky if white can exploit the queen's central position and the knight's slightly advanced outpost. The tension on the queen's side is about to escalate dramatically. Shifting the queen to g3 initiates a potential queenside invasion, eyeing the h7 pawn and creating discomfort for black's underdeveloped kingside pieces, while also preparing for possible advances on the kingside. Challenging white's queenside foothold, this pawn push aggressively expands black's dominion, aiming to disrupt white's harmonious piece development and potentially exploit any lingering weaknesses on the b2 square. Castling queenside immediately creates a dynamic imbalance, directly challenging black's central control and preparing an aggressive pawn storm on the kingside. Unleashing the knight towards the center, black aims to disrupt white's queenside expansion and potentially prepare for bb4, challenging the seemingly robust white structure. This knight's relocation, while active, could also invite tactical skirmishes if white's king remains exposed. Launching an aggressive pawn thrust on the kingside, white aims to seize control of the central dark squares and potentially create attacking chances against black's somewhat exposed monarch. This bold advance, however, does open up black's queenside counterplay and requires careful calculation to avoid overextending. The queen's repositioning hints at a desire for tactical skirmishes. Unleashing a knight to g4 after white's aggressive pawn thrust on f4 is a bold counterthrust, aiming to exploit the awkward placement of white's queen and potentially trap it. Black's intention is to create immediate disarray in white's camp, disrupting the intended kingside attack by creating a tactical puzzle for white to solve. This move injects a jolt of electricity into the position, demanding precise calculation from both sides. A remarkable piece of defensive maneuvering, sacrificing the bishop's attacking potential to weave a protective shield around the king, anticipating black's relentless pawn storm advancing on the queen's side. Pushing the pawn to h5 immediately creates a significant pawn chain aimed at white's kingside, potentially leading to a dangerous attack if black can follow up effectively with further pawn advances or piece repositioning. Unleashing a pawn spear, white dramatically escalates the central skirmish, immediately contesting the e5 square and aiming to disrupt black's knight's comfortable posting while potentially opening lines for future aggression. Unleashing a daring pawn thrust, black ruptures white's queenside structure, forcing a reckoning with the knight's precarious central perch and potentially opening aggressive avenues against the uncastled king. A strategic pivot, this knight's journey to the flank aims to disrupt black's aggressive queenside expansion by threatening a well-placed outpost or forcing concessions. The knight's aggressive thrust aims to disrupt white's queenside pawn structure and potentially launch a tactical assault, seeking to exploit the somewhat exposed king on the long diagonal. Asserting control over the d4 square, this knight repositions to a more central and active post, eyeing the weak squares around black's king and potentially supporting a future pawn thrust. Initiating development of the bishop to an active diagonal, this placement aims to pressure white's center and potentially support a queenside expansion, while simultaneously preparing for castling. Challenging the dominant knight and aiming to seize control of the central dark squares, this maneuver seeks to disrupt black's queenside expansion and potentially open lines for white's pieces. Black now aims to redeploy the bishop from its relatively passive post to a more dynamic square, potentially eyeing the queenside expansion and supporting the knight's advance while simultaneously reinforcing the d5 outpost. Unleashing the knight to its strongest outpost, this aggressive maneuver aims to dominate the central squares and prepare for a potent kingside assault, simultaneously questioning black's pawn structure. Unleashing the f-pawn offers a daring bid for central space, aggressively challenging white's knight and aiming to disrupt the opponent's pawn structure while simultaneously opening avenues for black's rook on f8. Unveiling the knight's attack route, this pawn push aims to dislodge the well-placed dark-squared bishop and potentially open a diagonal for the queen, while simultaneously challenging black's central control and creating space for white's own pieces. Pushing the pawn to h4 after 17. h3 is a bold, yet potentially precarious, attempt to seize territory and disrupt white's kingside setup. Black is clearly aiming to expand on the kingside, creating more space for their pieces and potentially forcing weaknesses in white's pawn structure. However, this advance also creates a permanent pawn lever, potentially overextended, which white might exploit by attacking the pawn's base or using the open diagonal to their advantage. It's a commitment that opens up new lines of play, but also introduces new vulnerabilities to defend. Intriguing repositioning of the queen aims to untangle the kingside and potentially launch an attack on the queenside by supporting a knight maneuver. The capture of the e-pawn is an aggressive gambit, sacrificing material for dynamic counterplay and aiming to disrupt white's kingside structure. Black hopes to open lines for their pieces and exploit the compromised pawn shield around the white king. This move fundamentally alters the immediate positional landscape, inviting a tactical skirmish rather than a slow maneuvering battle. The pressure on white is now tangible, as they must find a precise response to avoid succumbing to black's initiative. Opening up the h-file for the rooks, a bold decision that rips open the king's defenses, signals a clear intent to exploit the exposed enemy monarch, though it simultaneously invites sharp counterplay and potentially compromises white's pawn structure. Reclaiming the initiative, the knight makes a daring dive into the heart of white's position, directly challenging the exposed king and creating immediate threats. Unleashing the rook, white seizes the open file with aggressive intent, aiming to dismantle black's defenses with a direct assault on the kingside, creating immediate complications and demanding precise calculation from the opponent. This recapture is an audacious gambit, trading material for a potential assault on white's exposed king, though it leaves black's own monarch perilously underdefended amidst the chaos. Seizing the open file now feels like a decisive statement, putting immense pressure on black's exposed king and threatening to unleash a devastating battery along the newly conquered vertical. Reclaiming material while also solidifying queenside presence, this captures the pawn and repositions the queen to a more active central square, eyeing potential weaknesses in white's kingside pawn structure and preparing for counterplay. Unlocking the c-file's potential is the immediate aim here, potentially leading to a powerful battery formation against black's exposed king. The immediate goal is to contest the open h-file, but the maneuver risks allowing white's queen to penetrate further. A more pressing concern should be the exposed state of black's king after white's bishop has been so effectively positioned. Perhaps a move prioritizing king's safety, like bringing another piece to defend the monarch, would have been prudent before launching such a pawn offensive. Pivoting the queen back to h3 aims to reassert pressure on the king side, exploiting the now exposed black king and the weakened g-file. White is trying to create a decisive battery along the diagonal, potentially trapping the queen or forcing further concessions from black. This maneuver also clears the way for potential piece activation, preparing for a more direct assault. A daring check, immediately disrupting the queen's reign and forcing the king into a precarious dance, seeking refuge amidst a battlefield increasingly defined by open lines and looming threats. Relocating the king to the relative safety of b1 shores up the queen side and prevents immediate checks, a prudent step given black's active queen and the open diagonal leading towards white's monarch after the recent pawn exchanges. Unleashing the bishop to d5 fortifies the pawn chain and eyes the king side, while simultaneously creating a safe haven for the black king should the central tension escalate. A rather passive redeployment, allowing black's queenside pawns to achieve remarkable influence by surrendering the bishop's diagonal and conceding valuable space on the king side. Opening the bishop's diagonal offers a glimpse of potential counterplay, aiming to harass the weakened king side and potentially disrupt white's coordinated pieces, though the immediate material disadvantage looms large. Opening a pathway for the queen to rejoin the fray while simultaneously reinforcing the king's protection. This move signals a shift towards solidifying white's position after the preceding exchanges. Aimed at repositioning the knight from its currently cramped position, this maneuver seeks to gain an outpost on f3, offering potential for increased attacking pressure towards the white king, even as it opens lines for counterplay. A subtle positional maneuver now aims to consolidate white's slightly better piece activity and prepare for future development, potentially opening the bishop's diagonal. Disrupting the defensive pawn chain and inviting tactical fireworks, the knight embarks on a perilous journey to f3, aiming to destabilize white's king position and exploit the compromised dark squares around the monarch. Sacrificing the bishop opens lines towards the black king, a bold gambit aiming to disrupt black's defensive setup and potentially expose weaknesses that have been brewing since the early development. Unleashing the passed pawn's potential, this capture opens a critical diagonal for your bishop and simultaneously clears the way for the now advanced pawn to march forward, creating significant strategic complications for white's position. Unlocking the d4 square with the bishop clears a path for its brethren and prepares to reclaim central influence. The king steps out of the shadows, seeking shelter from the storm of white's pawns and knights, aiming to consolidate in a safer sector of the board amidst the unleashed chaos. A bold repositioning, aiming to untangle that congested queenside and potentially utilize the c1 square as a springboard for the knight, perhaps to d3 or even e2, seeking to improve its awkward placement. Unlocking the queen's pawn by stepping it forward offers a potential route for the rook to join the fray on the now open d-file, aiming to contest control of this critical central corridor. Reasserting pressure on the center, this maneuver by the knight aims to redeploy itself to a more active square, potentially supporting an advance on the king's side or challenging black's control of the d-file. Unleashing the central pawns, black boldly stakes a claim in the middle, disrupting white's carefully constructed pawn chain and creating immediate tactical possibilities. This aggressive thrust forces white to confront the newfound space and potentially opens lines that were previously sealed. Unlocking the blocked d-file with the bishop's retreat and preparation to potentially open the c-file signals white's attempt to shift the pressure and exploit the currently rather static central pawn structure, aiming to create imbalances and exploit the exposed king. Initiating the bishop's repositioning to a more active diagonal, this maneuver aims to bolster the central pawn structure and prepare for potential advances on the king side, where white's monarch remains somewhat exposed despite castling. Seizing the undefended pawn on b4 initiates a dramatic shift, aiming to disrupt black's seemingly harmonious pawn structure and potentially open lines. This aggressive thrust, while seemingly simple, forces black to confront a new structural vulnerability, demanding immediate attention and potentially forcing awkward defensive maneuvers for the e6 pawn. The hope is that by winning material, white can exploit the ensuing disarray, creating weaknesses around the black king or gaining a decisive endgame advantage. Unleashing the pawn's potential, this advance forcefully challenges the bishop's dominion and seeks to disrupt white's queenside structure. Unleashing a startling repositioning, the white queen abandons its post on h3, seeking a more dynamic influence by transferring to the kingside's central file. This retreat isn't merely a defensive maneuver. It's a strategic pivot, aiming to support the d4 pawn's advance and potentially reroute the queen to a more active square along the first rank, or even support a rook lift. The queen's presence on h1 now exerts subtle pressure, creating future threats that black must remain vigilant against, especially considering the weakened kingside structure. White is looking to build upon the spatial advantage gained from the pawn push on the kingside, and this queen transfer is a key part of that plan. The rook's bold advance along the c-file finally contests open space, setting up a potential confrontation for control of this vital artery and challenging white's already precarious pawn structure on the queenside. Unlocking the queenside majority by abandoning the knight opens up the file for potential infiltration. The black queen bravely ventures to the queenside, seeking to escape the pressure and find an active outpost amidst the chaos, potentially eyeing the isolated pawn on a6 and aiming to disrupt white's nascent attacking prospects before they can fully coalesce. A bold thrust, aiming to exploit the exposed dark squares around black's king and open up lines for a decisive attack. Exchanging queens here signals a dramatic shift, likely initiating an endgame where black's active pieces, particularly the knight now poised to re-enter the fray via c4 or e4, may pose significant threats against white's somewhat exposed king, especially if white cannot effectively consolidate their material advantage. The pawn's advance now opens the g-file, a critical pathway for the rook to penetrate black's defenses and exploit the exposed king, initiating a sharp endgame phase where every pawn advance carries significant weight in the race to create past threats. The bishop ventures to g5, a curious retreat aiming to activate the piece and potentially disrupt white's pawn structure. It appears black is seeking counterplay, perhaps hoping to exploit the open files or create tactical opportunities now that white's king is somewhat exposed on the kingside. This could lead to a dynamic middle game where both sides try to create threats. The rook's relocation to the open e-file immediately challenges black's queen and seeks to disrupt the pawn chain, potentially creating weaknesses around the black king. Unleashing a subtle piece redistribution, the bishop glides to c4, aiming to disrupt white's centralized control and eye potential skirmishes on the queen side, all while white's rook hesitates, unsure where to redeploy its newly acquired space. Opening the queen side for the rook to swing across to the king side offers a dynamic redistribution of forces, aiming to exploit the now exposed pawn and create new lines of attack. Focusing on the open files is paramount now. Repositioning the rook to the robust central file offers it the most dynamic prospects for future action. Unlocking the file for the rook, a tactical opportunity arises to disrupt black's pawn chain and potentially create weaknesses. Sacrificing the bishop here dramatically alters the material balance, simplifying the position into a queen and pawn endgame where black might find drawing chances due to the passed pawn on the queen side. But white's passed kingside pawn and more active king position offer considerable winning potential. Simplifying into a rook and pawn endgame after a long, complicated middle game fight, white aims to consolidate the material advantage and exploit the weak pawn structure. The rook now eyes the open c-file, potentially disrupting white's pawn structure on the queen side after the exchange. Pivoting the g-pawn forward is a bold attempt to activate the rook on the file, but it weakens the already precarious king position, potentially opening lines for black's bishop on c4. The rook's descent to the fifth rank finally forces a confrontation with white's weakened pawn structure, aiming to exploit the exposed g3 pawn and potentially create an outpost for the knight.